Welcome to Networking for Cybersecurity. Today we are going on a deep dive into one of the most foundational topics in the entire field of information security, the OSI model. Whether you are just starting your journey into networking or you want to understand how cyber attacks actually happen at the protocol level, this video is for you. By the end of this video, you will not only understand how data travels across a network, but you will also understand exactly where attackers try to break in, and more importantly, how defenders stop them. So let us get started. Before we talk about attacks and defenses, we need to build the foundation. The OSI model breaks down network communication into 7 distinct layers. Each layer has a specific job, and each layer only talks to the layer directly above or below it. This layered approach is brilliant because it allows engineers and security professionals to isolate problems, understand exactly where something went wrong, and build targeted defenses. We are going to walk through each of these 7 layers from the bottom up, starting with the physical world of cables and signals, all the way up to the applications you use every day. Layer 1, the physical layer. This layer is all about the raw transmission of bits, zeros and ones, across a physical medium. It does not care what those bits mean. It only cares about sending electrical signals, light pulses through fiber optics, or radio waves through the air from one device to another. The physical layer includes network cables such as copper twisted pair cables like Cat5e and Cat6, fiber optic cables that carry data as light, network interface cards, hubs, repeaters, and wireless radio frequencies used by Wi-Fi. Even the physical ports on your router and switches belong here. Essentially, if you can touch it and it carries raw signals, it lives at layer 1. Let's talk about attacks at this layer. Wiretapping is one of the oldest and most straightforward attacks at this layer. An attacker physically splices into or taps a cable to intercept electrical or optical signals passing through it. In corporate environments, this can mean someone physically accessing a server room or wiring closet to attach a passive tap device to a network cable, capturing all traffic flowing through it without disrupting the connection. Signal jamming is another physical layer attack, particularly relevant for wireless networks. An attacker floods a frequency band with interference signals, preventing legitimate devices from communicating. This is a form of denial of service at the most basic level. No software patch can fix it because the attack targets the physical medium itself. Hardware implants represent a more sophisticated threat. Nation-state actors and advanced persistent threat groups have been known to physically implant malicious hardware into network devices during manufacturing or shipping, a technique sometimes called a supply chain attack. These implants can intercept, record, or even modify data at the hardware level before any software-based security control ever sees it. Defending against physical layer attacks starts with physical security. Your network infrastructure, servers, switches, routers, patch panels, must be locked in access-controlled facilities. Only authorized personnel should ever have physical access to networking equipment. Badge readers, security cameras, and man-trap entry systems are all relevant controls here. Beyond physical access controls, organizations should use fiber optic cabling where possible, because it is significantly harder to tap than copper cables, and any physical tampering tends to disrupt the signal, making it detectable. Network monitoring tools can also detect unusual signal degradation or new devices appearing on the physical network. For supply chain risks, organizations should purchase hardware from trusted vendors, verify hardware integrity upon receipt, and where possible, inspect firmware on network devices before deployment. Key takeaway: physical layer security is the foundation of all other security controls. Moving up one level, we reach layer 2, the data link layer. If layer 1 is about physically moving bits from point A to point B, layer 2 is about organizing those bits into meaningful frames and making sure they reach the right device on a local network. This is the layer MAC addresses leave. MAC addresses, which stand for Media Access Control Addresses, are unique hardware identifiers burned into every network interface card. They look like 6 pairs of hexadecimal characters. Layer 2 devices include network switches, which use MAC address tables to forward frames only to the correct port. The switch learns MAC addresses by observing incoming frame and builds a table that maps MAC addresses to the correct port. One of the attacks at Layer 2 is MAC address flooding. In this attack, the attacker turns a smart switch into a dumb hub. A network switch maintains a CAM table, a map of MAC addresses to physical ports. When Alice sends data to Bob, the switch looks up Bob's MAC, finds port 3, and sends the frame only to port 3. The attacker runs a tool called Makeoff which can generate up to 155,000 fake MAC address entries per minute. Each frame arrives on the attacker's port with a randomly invented source MAC address. The switch faithfully records every new entry in the CAM table. Thousands of fake entries flood the table. The switch CAM table fills rapidly with fake MAC to port mappings. Legitimate entries, Alice, Bob, and Carol, are pushed out as the table overflows. The table can no longer hold the real device locations. Once the CAM table is completely full with fake entries, the switch enters the fail-open mode. When a frame arrives destined for Bob's MAC, the switch cannot find it in the table. Unable to determine the correct port, the switch broadcasts the frame out of every single port, just like a hub. Every frame on the network is now broadcast to every connected device, including the attacker. The attacker's packet sniffer captures all network traffic on the segment. Credentials, session tokens, emails, and file transfers. Now let's take a look at ways to defend against MAC flooding. Configure port security on managed switches to allow only a fixed maximum number of MAC addresses per physical port. Enable dynamic ARP inspection and DHCP snooping. Together, these controls ensure only known, legitimate MAC addresses are accepted on access ports. Deploy 802.1x port-based network access control. Every device connecting to a switch port must authenticate using credentials or certificates before the port is opened. Implement VLAN segmentation. This will limit the blast radius of an attack. Encrypt sensitive traffic. If all sensitive traffic is encrypted, the captured packets by the attacker are useless without the encryption keys. As a general rule in an enterprise network, unused switch ports should be administratively shut down so unauthorized users cannot plug in laptops or rogue devices and gain network access. Even if someone tailgates into the corporate environment, they should not be able to connect any device to the network. For active ports, organizations should enable 802.1x authentication, which requires users or devices to verify their identity before the switch allows network connectivity. 802.1x can be implemented using solutions such as Cisco Identity Services Engine. This adds a strong access control layer at the point of connection. Some devices, such as printers, IP phones, or older equipment, may not support 802.1x. In those cases, MAC-based authentication can be used, where the network checks the device's approved MAC address before granting access. Moving on, the Address Resolution Protocol, or ARP, also operates at this layer and is responsible for mapping IP addresses to MAC addresses within a local network. On a local network, if host A wants to send data to the gateway with the IP address of 192.168.1.1, it needs to know the MAC address of the gateway. Data frames travel using MAC addresses, not IP addresses. That's where Address Resolution Protocol comes into play. It maps an IP address like 192.168.1.1 to a physical MAC address like B. For host A to find the MAC address of its gateway, it sends a broadcast ARP packet to everyone on the segment. The gateway recognizes its IP and it sends an ARP reply directly to host A as a unicast packet. Host A receives the reply and stores the IP to MAC mapping in its ARP cache so it doesn't have to ask again. Now with that mapping existing, host A wraps its data in an Ethernet frame destined for MAC address B and sends it over. Since ARP has no authentication, the man-in-the-middle attack joins the network. Their goal is to sit in the middle of host A and the gateway to intercept sensitive data. The attacker sends a gratuitous ARP to host A saying the MAC address for the gateway is C, which is its own MAC address. It also sends a fake ARP packet to the gateway, saying the MAC address for host A is C, which is again its own MAC address. The attacker poisons the ARP caches of both the victim and the gateway simultaneously, inserting themselves into the middle of the traffic flow. All communication passes through the attacker invisibly, enabling credential theft, session hijacking, and data manipulation. Dynamic ARP inspection, or DAI, is a security feature available on managed switches that validates ARP packets against a DHCP snooping binding table. Only ARP replies that match known IP to MAC bindings are allowed through, effectively neutralizing ARP spoofing attacks. VLAN hopping is a Layer 2 network attack in which an attacker bypasses normal VLAN segmentation to gain access to traffic or systems on another VLAN that should be isolated. VLAN separate networks logically. Even though devices share the same physical switch, VLANs divide them into isolated broadcast domains. Finance, HR, and IT cannot reach each other by default. Now VLAN hopping breaks that isolation. This is where an attacker in the finance VLAN tricks the switch into forwarding their traffic into the HR or IT VLAN, gaining access they were never meant to have. In Layer 2, trunk links between switches carry tagged frames from all VLANs, whereas access ports carry frames for just one VLAN. Misconfigurations here are how attacks begin. This commonly happens in two ways: switch spoofing and double tagging. Both exploit how switches handle trunk negotiation and 802.1q VLAN tags. Both require only a misconfigured switch port to succeed. The attacker's machine sends dynamic trunking protocol frames pretending to be a switch. Because the real switch has automatic trunk negotiation enabled, it believes the attacker's device is a legitimate peer switch. Once the trunk is established, the attacker's port is no longer an access port, it is now a trunk carrying all VLANs. The attacker can send and receive traffic tagged for any VLAN on that switch, completely bypassing the intended segmentation. The other method is double tagging. The attacker crafts a frame with two 802.1q VLAN tags stacked. An outer tag matching the native VLAN, VLAN1, and an inner tag for the target VLAN, in our example VLAN 20. Switch 1 strips the outer tag because it matches the native VLAN, since no tag needed on the trunk. It then forwards the frame with only the inner VLAN 20 tag remaining. Switch 2 reads that inner tag and delivers the frame into VLAN 20, a segment the attacker was never authorized to reach. Note, this is a one-way attack, responses cannot return the same path, but it can still deliver malicious payloads. Now let's take a look at prevention methods. Turn off automatic trunk negotiation by disabling dynamic trunking protocol. Manually configure trunk and access ports. Change the native VLAN away from the default VLAN, VLAN1. Restrict allowed VLANs on trunk links. This limits the blast radius even if a trunk is established unexpectedly. Finally, run periodic configuration reviews on all switches. Moving on to Layer 3, the network layer. This is where networking becomes global. While Layer 2 is focused on communication inside a local network using MAC addresses, Layer 3 is responsible for logical addressing, routing, and moving data between different networks. It is the layer that allows your device to communicate with systems far beyond your home or office, including websites and cloud services across the Internet. This is where IP addresses live. The Internet Protocol IP is the core technology of Layer 3. Every device connected to a network is assigned an IP address, such as an IPv4 for address, like 192.168.1.10, or an IPv6 address. Private IPv4 for addresses, such as 192.168.x.x, or 10.x.x.x, are commonly used inside homes and businesses for internal communication. These addresses are not routable on the public Internet. This creates an important challenge. Devices inside a private network cannot directly communicate with Internet systems using private IP addresses alone. To solve this, Reuters use a process called network address translation. NAT converts a device's private IP address into the router's public IP address when sending traffic to the Internet. For example, your laptop may use 192.168.1.25 inside your home network, but when you browse a website, your router translates that traffic so it appears to come from your public ISP-assigned address. When the website responds, the router keeps track of the session and translates the returning traffic back to the correct internal device. This allows many devices in a home or business to share a single public IP address while keeping internal addresses hidden. NAT also helps conserve the limited supply of IPv4 addresses and adds a small layer of separation between internal systems and the Internet. Let's talk about attacks at the network layer. IP spoofing is a type of cyber attack where a hacker changes the sender's IP address in a data packet so it looks like the traffic is coming from another computer or device. Think of it like sending a letter with a fake return address. The message is still sent, but the identity of the sender is false. On a network, every device normally uses an IP address to send and receive data. This address helps identify where traffic comes from and where it should go. In an IP spoofing attack, the hacker creates packets with a fake source IP address to trick systems or hide their real location. Hackers use IP spoofing for several reasons. One common reason is to hide who they really are, making it harder for defenders to trace the attack. Another use is to pretend to be a trusted device. For example, if a network trusts traffic coming from a certain internal IP address, an attacker may try to copy that address. IP spoofing is also heavily used in DDoS attacks. In these attacks, the hacker spoofs the victim's IP address and sends requests to public servers. Those servers then send their replies to the victim instead of the attacker, flooding the victim with traffic and slowing systems down or taking them offline. It is important to understand that IP spoofing does not automatically give a hacker full access to a network. Changing an IP address alone does not mean the attacker can see replies coming back. In many cases, the response goes to the fake address being used. However, spoofing is still dangerous because it can be used for disruption, confusion, and attacks that rely on fake identities. Now, how to defend against IP spoofing attacks? Ingress and egress filtering. Configure routers and firewalls to drop packets whose source IP address could not legitimately come from the direction they arrived. If a packet enters your network from the Internet claiming to be from your private internal range, it is spoofed, drop it. Never use IP addresses alone for authentication. IP-based access control is fundamentally fragile because IPs can be spoofed. Always require cryptographic authentication, certificates, tokens, or mutual TLS for any system that grants access or privilege. Deploy anti-spoofing on network devices. Enable unicast reverse path forwarding, URPF, on routers. This feature checks whether the source address of an incoming packet is reachable via the interface it arrived on. If not, the packet is dropped. Use encrypted protocols. Encrypting traffic with TLS or IPsec ensures that even if an attacker crafts packets with a spoofed IP, they cannot forge the cryptographic handshake. Rate limit and filter amplification protocols. And finally, monitor for anomalous traffic patterns. Other attacks on this layer are the ping of death and the Smurf attack. ICMP-based attacks exploit the ping protocol for malicious purposes. The classic ping of death involved sending an oversized ICMP packet that would cause older systems to crash or freeze. The attacker crafts an ICMP packet with a payload that, when fully assembled, exceeds 65,535 bytes, the maximum allowed by the IPv4 specification. Because such large packets cannot travel the network in one piece, they are split into smaller fragments. When the target system attempts to reassemble the fragments, the combined size overflows the fixed size buffer allocated by the IP stack. This causes a buffer overflow, corrupting memory, crashing the system, or forcing a reboot. Modern operating systems are fully patched against this. They validate total reassembled size before allocating memory. On the other hand, Smurf attacks are a broadcast amplification variant where an attacker sends a ping with the victim's spoofed IP to a network broadcast address, causing every device on that network to send a ping reply to the victim simultaneously. The attacker sends a single ICMP echo request to a network's broadcast address, with the source IP field spoofed to the victim's IP. Every device on that network receives the broadcast ping and, following normal ICMP behavior, sends a reply to the source IP, which is the victim. With 100 devices on the amplifier network, one spoofed ping becomes 100 simultaneous replies hitting the victim. Services become unreachable. Next type of attack is ICMP flood attack. An ICMP flood is a brute force volumetric attack. The attacker or a botnet sends enormous numbers of normal-sized ping requests as fast as possible. The goal is pure volume, not technical exploitation. The target's network interface must receive and process every single one. There's nothing malformed to filter. The server becomes unresponsive to legitimate users even though nothing crashed or overflowed. It is simply buried under volume. Legitimate traffic, web requests, DNS queries, real users, gets crowded out and dropped because the network pipe is full of ICMP. Now, let's take a look at how to defend against ICMP attacks. Keep systems and firmware fully updated. Modern, patched operating systems validate the reassembled packet size before allocating memory, making the classic ping of death impossible. Configure firewalls to filter and rate limit ICMP. Firewalls and intrusion prevention systems should be configured to inspect ICMP traffic, block malformed or oversized packets, and apply rate limits to large volumes of ping requests. Disable directed broadcast forwarding on routers. On modern Cisco routers this is disabled by default. Verify it is off on all routers. And finally, deploy ingress filtering to block IP spoofing. Now, let's move another layer up the OSI stack. Layer 4 is the transport layer, and this is where the internet really comes to life from an application perspective. The transport layer is responsible for end-to-end communication between applications, managing how data is broken into segments, how those segments are reliably delivered, and how ports connect specific traffic to specific applications. The two primary protocols at Layer 4 are TCP and UDP. TCP, the Transmission Control Protocol, is a connection-oriented protocol that guarantees reliable, ordered delivery of data through a process called the three-way handshake. It also handles flow control and retransmission of lost packets. TCP is commonly used by applications that require reliable, ordered delivery of data, such as web browsing, HTTP and HTTPS. For email services such as SMTP, IMAP, POP3. For file transfers, for instance, FTP and SFTP. And remote administration like SSH and RDP. UDP, the User Datagram Protocol, is connectionless and sends data without establishing a formal connection or guaranteeing delivery, making it faster but less reliable. UDP is used where speed and low latency are more important than guaranteed delivery, such as DNS lookups, voice over IP calls, online gaming, live video streaming, and DHCP. In short, TCP is preferred for accuracy and completeness, while UDP is preferred for real-time performance. Port numbers also live at Layer 4, they tell the operating system which application should handle incoming data. Port 80 is HTTP, port 443 is HTTPS, port 22 is SSH, and so on. Now let's take a look at attacks at Layer 4. 3 attacks targeting TCP's connection mechanisms, exploiting the three-way handshake, probing open ports, and hijacking established sessions. In SYN Flood Attack, the attacker floods the server with thousands of SYN packets, each with a different spoofed source IP address. The server dutifully responds to each one with a SYN ACK and creates a half-open connection entry. Because the source IPs are fake, the final acknowledgement never arrives. The server waits, holding each entry open until a timeout. With enough incoming SYNs, the connection table fills completely. Once the table is full, the server cannot accept any new connections, including from legitimate users. The service is effectively offline, even though the server itself is running normally. Port scanning is a method for mapping open doors before the attack. As part of reconnaissance and before attacking, the attacker needs to know which ports are open and what services are listening. The attacker sends SYN packets to each target port in sequence or in parallel. Each SYN says, "I want to connect." The attacker waits for responses. This is the start of the TCP handshake. Port 80 responds with a SYN acknowledgement, indicating the port is open and the service, in this case HTTP, is running. Similarly, ports 22 and 443. However, port 3306 responds with a reset packet, indicating the port is closed or the service is not running. The attacker sends RST back to open ports to avoid logging a full connection. The technique is fast and stealthy. It maps the entire attack surface before the attacker commits to any specific exploit. Port scanning by itself is not illegal in many jurisdictions but is always the first step in a targeted intrusion. However, detecting it early is critical. Next attack is session hijacking. TCP uses sequence numbers to verify that packets belong to an established session. A legitimate client has completed the TCP handshake and is authenticated with the server. The server tracks this session using TCP sequence numbers. The server trusts any packet that arrives with the correct next sequence number. This trust mechanism is what the attacker will exploit. The attacker positions themselves on the same network segment and passively monitors traffic between the client and server. Every packet reveals the current sequence number. On unencrypted sessions, the attacker can see the exact sequence numbers and all data in transit. On older systems, TCP sequence numbers were predictable or poorly randomized, making this straightforward. TCP sequence numbers increment by the number of bytes sent. By watching the traffic, the attacker knows exactly what sequence number the server will accept next. The attacker crafts a TCP packet with the correct next sequence number and the client source IP. They inject it before the real client's next packet arrives. The server checks the sequence number, and it matches. The packet is accepted as legitimate. The server executes the attacker's command, believing it came from the authenticated client. The real client is now desynchronized. Their sequence numbers no longer match the server's expected state, and they are effectively ejected from their own session. Now let's take a look at preventative measures for attacks at the transport layer. Defending against SYN floods without allocating resources with SYN cookies. When a server detects a high rate of half-open connections, it switches to SYN cookie mode. Instead of allocating a connection table entry for each SYN, it encodes connection state into the sequence number of the SYN acknowledgement response. If the legitimate acknowledgement arrives, the state is reconstructed from the cookie. If it never arrives, no resources were wasted. Next, throttling connection attempts at the firewall with rate limiting. Configure firewalls and the operating system's TCP stack to limit the rate of incoming SYN packets from any single source. Then minimize the attack surface by closing unnecessary ports and services. The most effective defense against port scanning is having as few open ports as possible. Next, preventing session hijacking with TLS encryption. Encrypting all communications with TLS prevents session hijacking. And finally, randomized TCP sequence numbers. Ensure all networked systems are running modern and patched OS versions. Layer 5 of the OSI model is the session layer, responsible for establishing, managing, and terminating communication sessions between applications on different devices. It acts like a coordinator that starts conversations between systems, keeps them synchronized while data is exchanged, and properly closes the connection when communication is finished. The session layer also provides checkpoints and recovery mechanisms, allowing sessions to resume if interrupted. How is a session established and managed? A client requests a session with a server, and the server responds to accept it. Once established, both systems exchange data while the session layer tracks the connection state. When finished, the session is terminated cleanly. Some of the real-world examples are the following. Remote desktop uses sessions to keep users connected while they work remotely. Voice over IP calls rely on sessions to maintain live voice communication. Database connections also use sessions during queries and transactions. Key protocols at this layer are protocols such as NetBIOS and RPC help manage sessions between systems. They allow devices to identify each other, establish connections, and exchange commands reliably. The session layer works above the transport layer and below the presentation layer. It depends on lower layers for data delivery while providing session control to upper layers. Now let's take a look at session layer attacks. Attackers exploiting weak session token handling to hijack authenticated identities without ever stealing a password. Session fixation, also known as the pre-authentication trap attack. Session fixation exploits one critical flaw. The application does not generate a new session token after successful login. In this attack, the attacker visits the site, obtains a valid but unauthenticated token. In our example ABC123, then tricks the victim into logging in while using that same token. The attacker sends the victim a crafted phishing link that includes the known session token in the URL parameter, which in this instance is bank.com with ABC123 token. When the victim clicks it, the browser loads the login page with that preset session token. The victim enters their credentials and successfully authenticates. The server verifies the password and maps the session, but does not generate a new token. Session ABC123 is now authenticated as the victim's account, and the attacker's known token just became privileged. The attacker then sends a request to the server with token ABC123, the same token they've known all along. The server looks up ABC123 in the session store and finds it maps to the victim's authenticated account. Full access granted and no password needed. The next type of attack is session replay, which is basically reusing a token which was once legitimate. The attacker captures a valid session token through sniffing, malware, or credential exposure, then resubmits it to the server later, potentially long after the original session should have expired. The victim sends a request to the server, including their session token, in our example, token 789, in the HTTP header or cookie. The server validates the token and responds. This is normal, expected behavior. The token proves the user's identity. The attacker is monitoring traffic on the same network or has compromised a network device. They capture the HTTP request and extract token 789. They now have a copy of a perfectly valid, authenticated session token. The attacker doesn't need to act immediately. They store token 789 and wait, hours, days, or longer. If the server does not properly expire sessions or invalidate tokens on logout, the token will remain valid indefinitely. The attacker submits a new request to the server using token 789. The server receives what looks like a perfectly normal, authenticated request. The server accepts the replayed token and responds as if the victim were making the request. The attacker can read data, make transactions, or change account settings. The next attack is session hijacking. Unlike Layer 4 session hijacking, which targets TCP sequence numbers, Layer 5 session hijacking targets the application-level session token, typically a cookie. The attacker steals a valid, active session cookie, then uses it to impersonate the victim to the web application. The two most common methods are network sniffing, which is capturing cookies from unencrypted HTTP traffic on a shared network, and cross-site scripting, which is injecting JavaScript into a page that reads the cookie and sends it to the attacker. The victim is logged into a web application. The server has issued a session cookie, session ID XYZ999, which is sent automatically with every HTTP request. If the connection is unencrypted, HTTP instead of HTTPS, this cookie travels in plaintext across the network. The attacker is on the same Wi-Fi network, for example, in a coffee shop, hotel, or compromised corporate network, and runs a packet sniffer. They can capture every unencrypted HTTP request the victim sends, including all cookies attached to those requests. The sniffer captures a request containing session ID XYZ999. The attacker extracts this cookie. This is the victim's live, authenticated session token. It represents their currently active, logged-in state. No password cracking needed. The attacker injects the stolen cookie into their own browser or sends it in a crafted HTTP request. The request looks identical to a request from the victim. The same token and the same header format. The server has no way to distinguish who is really sending it. The server grants the attacker full access to the victim's account. Both the victim and the attacker may be simultaneously using the same session. The victim is still browsing normally, unaware their account is being accessed by someone else. Now let's take a look at defense at the session layer. Regenerate session tokens after authentication. The single most important defense against session fixation. Always issue a brand new, cryptographically random session token immediately after a user successfully logs in. Use cryptographically random, long session tokens. Session tokens must be generated using a cryptographically secure random number generator and be long enough to resist brute force guessing. Enforce session expiry and idle timeouts. Every session token must have a maximum lifetime, after which it is invalidated regardless of activity. Additionally, implement an idle timeout. If a session is inactive for more than a defined period, the server should invalidate it. This dramatically limits the window of opportunity for session replay attacks. Use HTTPS everywhere. All session cookies must travel exclusively over HTTPS connections. Next, set HTTP only and same site cookie flags. The HTTP only flag prevents JavaScript from accessing session cookies. The same site flag prevents the cookie from being sent in cross-site requests, blocking cross-site request forgery. Finally, invalidate sessions properly on logout and use multi-factor authentication. When a user logs out, the server must immediately delete the session from the server-side session store. Additionally, implementing multi-factor authentication ensures that even if a session is compromised, the attacker cannot establish a new authenticated session from scratch without access to the second factor. Layer 6 of the OSI model is the presentation layer, responsible for translating, formatting, encrypting, and preparing data so different systems can understand each other. It sits between the application layer and lower network layers, ensuring information is delivered in a usable format. Its core tasks include converting data between formats and encrypting and decrypting information for security, compressing data to reduce bandwidth usage, and handling character encoding standards such as ASCII, UTF-8, and Unicode. In operation, data received from the application layer is processed through functions like translation, encryption, compression, and encoding before being sent onward, then reversed on the receiving side. Real-world examples include secure web browsing with HTTPS, where TLS SSL encrypts traffic. Email systems using MIME formatting and encryption. Database communication using formats such as JSON, XML. Cloud services that rely on standardized, compressed, and encrypted data exchange. Common technologies associated with this layer include TLS SSL, MIME, ASCII, UTF-8, Unicode, ASN.1, XML, JSON, and image formats like JPEG, PNG, and GIF. The presentation layer also works closely with adjacent layers. It receives raw application data from layer 7, transforms it into a secure and standardized format, and passes it down to layer 5 for session handling and onward transmission. Moving on to attacks at layer 6. The presentation layer handles encryption, encoding, compression, and data format translation. Attacks here target how data is protected in transit and how applications parse incoming data, exploiting weak encryption, downgrading security protocols, and abusing deserialization logic. One of the attacks in this layer is SSL stripping. In this attack, the encryption is silently removed. The attacker positions themselves as a man in the middle, on the same Wi-Fi network, via ARP spoofing, or through a rogue access point. All traffic between the user and the internet flows through the attacker's machine. The user types bank.com without specifying HTTPS. Their browser sends a plain HTTP request. Normally the server would redirect to HTTPS, but the attacker intercepts this request first. The attacker establishes their own legitimate HTTPS connection to the bank server. From the server's perspective, this is a normal secure connection. The attacker receives the HTTPS response from the bank, decrypts it, changes all HTTPS links to HTTP, and forwards the modified page to the victim over plain HTTP. The victim enters their username and password. Because their browser is connected to the attacker via HTTP, the form submission travels in plaintext to the attacker. The attacker reads the credentials, then forwards them to the real server over their HTTPS connection. The bank sends a valid login response. The victim believes they logged in successfully. However, the attacker captured the credentials and session token without the victim knowing anything was wrong. Let's see how we can protect against SSL stripping. Implement HTTP Strict Transport Security, also known as HSTS. HSTS is a browser security policy that tells a site's visitors to use HTTPS only instead of HTTP. Redirect all HTTP to HTTPS at the server level. This combined with HSTS creates defense in depth. Finally, set the secure flag on all session and authentication cookies. Browsers with this flag set will never transmit the cookie over an unencrypted HTTP connection. TLS negotiation works by the client advertising its highest supported version and the server choosing from that list. A man-in-the-middle attacker can intercept and modify the client hello message, removing modern version so the server believes the client only supports old and weak protocols. In our example, the client supports multiple TLS versions, TLS 1.3, 1.2, 1.1, and older SSL. For backward compatibility, the server also accepts older versions. The client sends a client hello with its highest supported version TLS 1.3. The attacker intercepts the client's hello message. The attacker modifies the message, removing TLS 1.3 and TLS 1.2 entries, so only SSL 3.0 remains. This modified message is forwarded to the server. The server receives what looks like a client hello from a client that only supports SSL 3.0. Because backward compatibility is enabled, the server agrees to SSL 3.0 and responds with a server hello specifying that version. Neither side knows the negotiation was tampered with. The connection is established using SSL 3.0, a version known to be cryptographically broken. Using the poodle technique, the attacker can decrypt session data. To defending against protocol downgrade, remove all old protocol versions from your server's TLS configuration. Enable TLS fallback signaling cipher sweep value, also known as RFC 7507. This is a mechanism where the client includes a special signal in its client hello when it is intentionally connecting at a lower TLS version. Finally, disable weak ciphers, and use strong cipher suites only. The next attack is insecure deserialization. Applications regularly receive data from users, cookie values, API parameters, and form submissions. That data is often in a serialized format such as JSON, XML, or binary, and the application must deserialize it, converting it back into live objects in memory. This conversion process is the attack surface. When an application deserializes untrusted data, the deserialization library may automatically instantiate objects and call their methods, including special lifecycle methods like constructors. An attacker can craft a payload that, when deserialized, creates an object whose constructor or destructor contains malicious logic. This can lead to remote code execution, the most severe vulnerability category. The attacker studies the application's deserialization library and crafts a payload that, when deserialized, will instantiate a dangerous class, such as a process executor or file writer. The payload looks like normal application data from the outside. It is sent to the application via a cookie, HTTP body, or API parameter. The application's deserializer receives the data and begins converting it into objects. It does not validate the class types being instantiated. It simply constructs whatever objects the data describes and the dangerous class constructor begins executing. The object's constructor or lifecycle method contains a system command, for example, a bash reverse shell. The OS executes it with the permissions of the application server process. The attacker's command runs on the server. A reverse shell connects back to the attacker's machine, giving them interactive command line access to the server. They can read files, steal database credentials, install backdoors, or pivot deeper into the network. To defend against insecure deserialization, the application owner should do input validation, allow listing, and implement least privilege controls that stop malicious payloads. The safest defense is to avoid deserializing user-supplied data entirely. redesign APIs to accept only simple and validated data types such as strings, numbers, and booleans rather than serialized object graphs. Where deserialization is unavoidable, ensure the source is cryptographically authenticated before processing. Implement strict type allow listing during deserialization. If you must deserialize, configure your deserialization library to only allow a specific whitelist of expected object types. Next, keep all libraries and frameworks fully updated. Maintain a software composition analysis tool that continuously monitors your dependencies and alerts you when a library with a known deserialization CVE is in use. Finally, run applications with the least privilege. This contains the blast radius if an attack succeeds. Layer 7, also known as the application layer, serves as the direct interface between end-user software applications and the network. It does not refer to the applications themselves, such as a web browser or email client, but instead provides the protocols and services, such as HTTP, SMTP, FTP, and DNS. Those applications used to communicate and access network resources. As the top layer of the OSI model, it enables application-level communication, identifies remote services, checks resource availability, and supports data exchange between systems. In modern networks, Layer 7 can also provide advanced functions such as content-based load balancing, where traffic is routed based on the contents of the request rather than only IP addresses or ports. SQL injection is a critical web security vulnerability that allows an attacker to interfere with the queries that an application makes to its database. The attack exploits the way applications handle user-supplied data, essentially tricking the database into executing malicious code instead of literal data. The attack typically follows these four distinct phases. Initially, in a secure state, the application takes a username, like Alice, and places it into a predefined SQL string. The database looks for that specific record, and the application proceeds with a predictable logic flow. Then the attacker enters a tautology payload, such as OR the 1 equals 1. The initial single quote is the crucial breakout character that signals to the database that the data field has ended, allowing the attacker to append their own SQL commands. Then the web application glues this input into the query without sanitizing it. The query's logic is fundamentally altered, and instead of searching for a specific user, it now asks the database to find any user where the name matches OR where the statement is true. Because 1 is equal to 1 is always true, the database's filtering mechanism is bypassed. In Phase 4, the database executes the corrupted query and returns every record in the table. The web server, expecting only one result, usually grants access to the first account returned, which is frequently the administrator account, resulting in full unauthorized access. The most effective way to prevent SQL injection is through the use of parameterized queries, also known as prepared statements. In this phase, the application sends the SQL query structure to the database first, using placeholders for the data. When the user input is finally sent, the database is already programmed to treat it strictly as a literal string. Now let's take a look at cross-site scripting attack. In a normal submission, a regular user posts a comment. The application performs standard validation and prepares the database query. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, the attacker identifies a comment field and carefully crafts a malicious payload with a tag. They bypass client-side filters and send the request. Since the server fails to encode output symbols, it saves the raw JavaScript directly into the database, making the attack persistent. Now when an unsuspecting victim loads the page, the server fetches the comment from the database and delivers it to the victim's browser. Finally, the browser interprets the fetched data as code rather than text. The cross-site script triggers, and the attacker is stealing the victim's session cookie. DNS poisoning is an application layer attack. DNS itself is like the internet's address book. When you type bank.com, DNS translates that name into an IP address like 1.2.3.4. Without DNS, you would need to memorize IP addresses for every site you visit, which is not practical. Every DNS query is tagged with a transaction ID, which is a 16-bit number. 16-bit can cover 65,535 IDs. The resolver only accepts a response if the transaction ID matches the outstanding query. The classic attack floods the resolver with thousands of forged responses, each guessing a different transaction ID. With only 65,535 possibilities, a flood of fake replies has a high chance of guessing correctly before the real response arrives. Once a single forged reply matches, the resolver caches the fake record. Every subsequent user asking for that domain gets the wrong IP until the TTL expires. Now let's see this in action. A user wants to visit bank.com. Their browser asks the local DNS resolver for the IP address of bank.com. The resolver checks its cache for the entry of bank.com, and since it is not there, it must query the authoritative DNS server. This query process is the window the attacker exploits. The user's browser sends a DNS query to the resolver with a transaction ID 4821. The attacker has been watching for DNS queries from this resolver. They immediately flood it with thousands of forged replies, each with a different guessed transaction ID. The message in each resolves bank.com to the IP address of 9.9.9.9. Hoping one of those guesses may match the real transaction ID 4821. The real authoritative DNS server sends the correct reply for bank.com with the IP address of 1.2.3.4. But one of the attacker's fake replies arrived first and matched the transaction ID 4821. The resolver accepted the forged record and cached it, and the real reply is now ignored because it arrived too late. The resolver's cache now maps bank.com to 9.9.9.9. When the user's query is answered, they receive the attacker's IP. The user's browser connects to 9.9.9.9, which is the attacker's server. The fake bank site looks identical to the real one, and the user has no idea they are on a fake server. To defend against DNS poisoning attacks, implement DNS security. This adds digital signatures to DNS records so resolvers can verify that a response genuinely came from the authoritative source and has not been modified in transit. Use DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS. Traditional DNS queries travel in plaintext over UDP, and anyone on the network path can read and inject responses. However, an encrypted DNS channel removes the ability for an attacker to inject forged responses. Next, randomize the source port and transaction ID. Modern DNS resolvers defend against transaction ID guessing by also randomizing the source UDP port for each query. Finally, use a trusted, security-focused DNS resolver. The official 7 layers of OSI model are covered. Now let's talk about the one that breaks everything, Layer 8. Layer 8, often jokingly called the human layer or user layer, represents the people who interact with technology and can either strengthen or weaken every other layer of security. While firewalls, encryption, endpoint protection, and monitoring systems help defend the network, a single careless action, such as clicking a phishing link, reusing weak passwords, approving a fake MFA request, or sharing sensitive information, can bypass multiple technical controls. Because of this, users are often the final line of defense. Strong Layer 8 security depends on cyber awareness, verifying suspicious emails and websites, using unique passwords with multi-factor authentication, keeping devices updated, protecting confidential data, and reporting unusual activity quickly. Attackers commonly target this layer through phishing, social engineering, fake websites, malicious attachments, SMS scams, and fraudulent phone calls because manipulating people is often easier than hacking systems. In practice, a security-aware user becomes a human firewall. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you found this helpful, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to help our channel stay ahead of the threats and keep the algorithm from overflowing with the wrong stuff.